If you are hearing this, Mars is dead. Not in the poetic sense. Not stripped of its atmosphere by solar flares or left to freeze in the quiet dark of space. Mars was erased. 3 billion souls and 90% of the United Earth Defense Fleet burned to ash in less than 40 minutes. They called themselves the Valen Hegemony, but we didn't care what they called themselves when their shadows fell over the colonies. We cared about what they could do. And what they could do defied every law of tactical engagement we had spent 3 centuries mastering. I was on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Aegis 7 when the Fifth Fleet made its stand over the Martian equator. We opened up with everything in our high-tech inventory. Gigawatt pulse lasers, superheated plasma torpedoes, focused gamma beams capable of slicing a mountain in half. We poured millions of terawatts of pure, concentrated energy into their forward formations. And do you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Their ships were wrapped in what we now know as thermal dissipative energy matrices. Aegis shields, as the brass called them before the brass stopped existing. When our plasma hit their forward barriers, it didn't explode. It didn't even scorch their hulls. The energy simply dissolved into a faint, violet shimmer. Their shields didn't just absorb our fire, they harvested it. Every gigawatt we fired into their defensive grid was instantly converted into thermal kinetic power for their own plasma banks. We were literally feeding their weapon systems with our own fire. Within half an hour, the Fifth Fleet was nothing more than molten metal drifting through space. My ship barely made it out, venting atmosphere, running on emergency cold thrusters, limping back behind the rings of Saturn to the industrial ice mines of Titan. Now we are sitting in the freezing dark beneath 300 kilometers of frozen methane and rock. The Valen Armada is casually sweeping through the inner system, burning Earth's orbital platforms one by one, moving with the slow, arrogant confidence of a predator that knows its prey has no claws left. They think we're out of options. They think because our power grids are dark and our laser banks are fried, humanity is ready to crawl into a hole and die. They don't understand us. When you spend 10,000 years developing weapons, you learn a few basic truths about conflict. The Valen built their entire empire on the assumption that energy is the ultimate force in the universe. They spent millennia perfecting shields that can redirect light, heat, and radiation. They built a defensive god. But they forgot one simple, fundamental thing. When you take away a human's fire, we don't surrender. We just remember how to throw stones. We intercepted their comms 3 days after Mars burned. Our decrypt arrays deep inside Titan's icy core were still pulling down Valen transmissions through the quantum noise. When the tactical software translated their high-frequency military dial, it didn't sound like a fleet preparing for a war. It sounded like an extermination crew discussing pest control. They called us Thermal Primitive Class 4. According to their battle logs, the Valen Hegemony hadn't faced a physical kinetic weapon in 6,000 cycles. And why would they? Across the known galaxy, warfare had evolved along a single, elegant line: power generation, directed energy, localized space folding, and particle shields. To an advanced species, fighting with solid matter, with physical lead, iron, or steel, was viewed as utterly primitive. Why waste hull space carrying millions of tons of heavy metal when you could generate endless plasma from a microfusion core? Their Aegis matrix was designed for that exact philosophy of ultimate energy warfare. It operated on subatomic harmonic dispersion. When a high-yield laser or superheated plasma bolt hit the shield, the barrier instantly matched the weapon's wavelength, breaking the energy down into base thermal vectors and spreading it harmlessly across the hull. The higher the energy output of the incoming weapon, the faster the shield neutralized it. Our antimatter torpedoes, our nuclear thermal charges, our gamma lances, they weren't just useless. They were ideal targets for the Valen defense grid. We were shooting lightning at a sponge. I listened to the recorded voice of their fleet commander, translated through our naval engines. His tone wasn't even aggressive. It was bored. The native fleet relies exclusively on thermal overload vectors, he reported back to their central command. Their heavy ordnance lacks frequency adaptation. Zero tactical threat. Sol system pacification will be completed within 72 planetary rotations. 72 hours to wipe out 8 billion people. Looking at our tactical displays, I couldn't even blame him for his confidence. Every military doctrine Earth had spent 200 years building was focused on energy density. We wanted faster plasma, hotter beams, tighter focus. We had spent decades making ourselves perfectly predictable, marching straight into a tactical trap built by an empire that had mastered energy physics before human beings learned to forge steel. Standing in the central control vault of Titan's subsurface hub, surrounded by pale, exhausted technicians watching the Valen fleet cruise casually past Jupiter, A junior weapons engineer named Chief Miller looked up from his console. He wasn't looking at our naval defense networks. He was looking at the structural telemetry for Titan's automated heavy mining grid. "Commander," Miller said, his voice barely a whisper in the freezing room. "The Valen shields, they're programmed to absorb electromagnetic radiation, high thermal bleed, and charged particle vectors, right?" "That's what the Mars telemetry proved," I answered. "Anything with a heat signature or a plasma yield just feeds their battery." "What happens," Miller asked, turning his screen toward me, "if we don't give them any energy to absorb?" I stared at his readouts. "What are you talking about, Chief?" Miller pointed a trembling finger at the long-range industrial logs. "What happens if we hit them with something cold, dark, and heavy as hell?" Titan was never meant to be a fortress. It was a quarry. For 50 years, the United Earth Mining Consortium had hollowed out Saturn's moon, burning miles of deep core tunnels into frozen methane and water ice to reach the dense metallic veins beneath. They didn't build high-tech weapons platforms on Titan. They built heavy industrial machinery designed to do one thing: move absurd amounts of dead heavy rock from point A to point B. Deep in subterranean Vault 9, 2 miles beneath the ice crust, the air smelled like ozone, hot grease, and old hydraulic fluid. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, synthetic air of our destroyed fleet flagships. There were no sleek plasma conduits here. No delicate quantum computing arrays. Just thousands of tons of structural steel, heavy magnetic coils, and industrial-grade linear accelerators. Chief Miller led me past rows of mothballed rock crushers to the main launch tube of Sector 12. Before the war, this system was used to launch 10-ton containers of raw ore out of Titan's shallow gravity well, slinging them across the Sol system to the shipyards at Luna. It was essentially a linear magnetic mass driver, a 4-kilometer tube of raw superconducting magnets built into the solid bedrock of the moon. It was crude. It was ancient technology. The military had phased out mass drivers a century ago when directed energy weapons became compact enough to fit on a frigate. The Navy called these things obsolete because you can't steer a rock once it leaves the tube, Miller said, patting the cold housing of a primary power breaker. They said targeted lasers were cleaner, more precise. But an ore driver doesn't care about tactical precision, Commander. It cares about mass. I walked over to the edge of the loading rail. Sitting in the automated staging rack were rows of unrefined, solid alloy slugs, dense, industrial-grade tungsten carbide darts originally forged to drill through asteroid cores. Each one was 6 meters long, solid metal, weighing upwards of 50 tons. No microchips. No internal guidance. No explosive warheads. No energy signature whatsoever. Just 50 tons of raw, unapologetic inertia. If we wire the main power generators from the shattered hull of the Aegis, 7 directly into the coil arrays of Launch Tube 12, Miller explained, his eyes burning with an unhinged, desperate energy, we can bypass every single safety limiter built into the mining grid. "How fast can we push one of these slugs, Chief?" I asked. Miller wiped grease from his forehead and smiled a dark, hollow smile. "With safety protocols off and the ship's reactor dumping raw current into the magnetic coils? We can accelerate 50 tons of solid iron and tungsten to roughly 15% of the speed of light before it even clears the barrel." I calculated the numbers in my head, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I felt the cold knot of terror in my chest loosen just a fraction. At 0.15 C, a 50-ton projectile doesn't need an explosive payload. It carries enough raw kinetic energy to hit with the force of a multi-megaton thermonuclear warhead. But unlike a warhead, there is no thermal flash before impact. No plasma bleed. No radiation signature to trigger automated defense grids. It was just heavy, blind momentum moving through the dark. "Start rewiring the coils," I told him. "Strip every auxiliary system in the bunker. If it isn't keeping us breathing, feed its power to the launch tubes." We were about to turn an entire moon into a shotgun. For 3 days we worked in the dark, breathing stale air and wiping frozen condensation off our helmets. Every tactical simulation we ran confirmed the same terrifying reality. The Valen Aegis matrix was a masterpiece of physics, provided you fought them on their terms. Their field sensors were tuned to detect electromagnetic excitation. The moment an enemy ship charged a laser bank or locked an active radar array, or spun up a plasma injector, the Valen shields instantly shifted frequency to counter the exact thermal signature of the incoming attack. They had designed the perfect lock. But we weren't bringing a key. We were bringing a sledgehammer. A tungsten carbide dart carries no heat. It radiates no thermal energy, emits no active radar guidance, and operates on zero electric current once it leaves the magnetic field of the acceleration barrel. To the Valen automated warning systems, a cold tungsten projectile falling through space looks like nothing more than a stray piece of space debris, a tiny harmless rock drifting through the void. Except this rock moves at 45,000 kilometers per second. Chief Miller and his crew hand-cranked the heavy loader rails, sliding the 50-ton slugs into the open britches of the subterranean linear accelerators. We didn't use targeting computers. The Valen electronic warfare grid was so advanced it could detect a targeting ping from 3 light seconds away and jam the tracking signal before the beam even reached them. Instead, we went back to basic ballistics. Optical scopes. Manual triangulation. Equations worked out on paper using mechanical slide rules and pure Newtonian calculus. We weren't locking onto their ships. We were aiming at the empty patch of space where their ships would be 30 seconds after launch. In modern space combat, everyone relies on guidance systems. Missiles adjust their trajectories mid-flight. Plasma bolts are directed by magnetic fields. The Valen had spent thousands of years perfecting countermeasures, point defense lasers, and electronic jamming pods to neutralize smart weapons. They had absolutely zero defense against an object that couldn't be jammed, couldn't be redirected, and didn't care about electronic warfare. Once a 50-ton tungsten rod leaves a coilgun barrel, it obeys only one law. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an equal and opposite force. The Valen fleet was about to become that opposite force. By the 4th day, 6 rewired mining drivers sat hidden beneath the crusted ice of Titan, aimed straight up at the orbital plane of Saturn's rings. The barrels were cold. The power grids were quiet. We sat in the silent, frozen darkness of the bunker, waiting for the hegemony to march directly into our crosshairs. They thought they had stripped us of our fire. They had no idea we were holding the cold iron. The Valen fleet entered the Saturn system in full battle parade. 12 capital dreadnoughts, surrounded by 30 escort cruisers, swept past the outer moons with their drive cones burning bright, brilliant white against the deep black of the void. They didn't spread out. They didn't deploy screening scouts. Why would they? In their minds, they were clearing out a shattered, primitive extermination zone. Their wideband radio broad-spectrum arrays began broadcasting automated surrender demands. The translation looped endlessly across every frequency. Unconditional yield of planetary resources. Complete disarmament. Resistance will result in immediate atmosphere incineration. We didn't answer. We kept every active sensor dark. The power draw across Titan's subsurface grid was suppressed to the bare minimum required to keep our lungs from freezing. On their tactical scopes, Titan looked like a dead, ice-locked ball of rock, littered with the abandoned ruins of a defeated mining operation. Through our passive optical arrays, we watched them drift into the Saturn Gap, a clear 3,000-kilometer corridor between the planet's outer rings and the orbit of Titan. It was a textbook tactical formation for a fleet expecting zero resistance. Tight, arrogant, and stacked hull to maximize their defensive shield overlap. Their Aegis matrices were lit up, shimmering with that familiar violet glow, ready to convert any desperate laser strike into energy for their forward plasma arrays. In the command vault, the air temperature had dropped to -10 Celsius. Every breath we exhaled hung in thick, white clouds. No heater ran. No AUX gen cycled. Target group entering primary kill vector, Chief Miller whispered, his gloved fingers resting on the manual knife switches connected directly to the primary capacitor banks. 20 seconds. The Valen flagship, a massive 3-kilometer slab of dark composite armor named the Vanguard of Hegemony, glided directly into line with Launch Tube 4. Behind it, 2 heavy cruisers lined up like cattle in a chute. "Hold," I said softly into the comm mic. "Let them settle into the arc." 10 seconds. Their radio broadcast changed tone, shifting from surrender demands to automated targeting locks directed at our surface ice domes. They were preparing to burn Titan's upper crust just to be thorough. They were powering up their plasma batteries, drawing energy into their weapon banks. 5 seconds. The entire Valen formation was now dead center in our crosshairs, moving at 70 kilometers per second down a firing line calculated by mechanical gears and graphite pencils. I looked down at the physical breaker in front of me. No software lock. No digital confirmation. Just copper cables and sheer human spite. "Commander," Miller said, his teeth chattering from the cold, "they're charging their planetary glassing beams." I grabbed the heavy metal lever and slammed it down. The subterranean magnetic coils roared. Deep beneath Titan's ice, 6 gigawatts of raw current dumped into the launch barrels in a fraction of a millisecond. The ground beneath our feet didn't just shake, It cracked. Up on the surface, 6 silent plumes of displaced gas erupted from the ice as 50-ton solid tungsten darts tore through the atmosphere and punched into the void. There was no flash of laser light. No trailing beam of superheated plasma. No glowing rocket trails. Just dark, cold metal moving through the vacuum at 45,000 kilometers per second. It took less than 2 seconds for the first dart to bridge the gap between Titan and the Valen formation. On the bridge of the vanguard of Hegemony, their tactical display probably didn't even flash an alarm. Their automated Aegis matrix was waiting for energy. It was waiting for a frequency to match, a thermal vector to disperse, a particle charge to absorb. It received 50,000 kilograms of solid tungsten carbide moving at 15% of the speed of light. Physics does not negotiate. When that first dart struck the flagship's forward shield, there was no energy to dissipate. The Aegis field didn't absorb the blow. The kinetic force instantly overwhelmed the localized gravity anchors holding the shield in place. The force barrier collapsed inward, slamming backward into the flagship's forward bow with the impact of 1,000 nuclear warheads focused on a point no wider than a dinner plate. The kinetic transfer was absolute. The 3-kilometer-long alien dreadnought didn't just break. It crumpled. The forward hull collapsed into itself like an aluminum can under a hydraulic press. Star alloy armor, primary weapon banks, and thousands of alien crew members were compressed into a mass of mangled metal in a fraction of a second. The kinetic shockwave tore straight through the length of the ship, blowing out the rear engine housings and scattering wreckage across 300 kilometers of space. A ship that had survived 30 human energy fleets was wiped from existence before its bridge crew could even register a threat. A second later, our secondary launch barrels cycled and fired again. The next dart caught an escort cruiser square midship, shearing the vessel cleanly into 2 halves that tumbled wildly into Saturn's ring plane. The third and fourth darts slammed into a heavy battlecruiser, the sheer shockwave of the kinetic impact shattering its internal pressure hulls and turning the ship into a drifting cloud of frozen mist and shattered plating. In less than 20 seconds, the invulnerable Valen Hegemony had lost 4 capital ships. And not a single energy sensor in their entire fleet could tell them where the shots were coming from. Panic is a universal language. You don't need a decrypt array to recognize it. The Valen broad-spectrum frequencies, once smooth and full of cold, arrogant authority, devolved into a wall of screaming static and frantic distress signals. The invincible armada was breaking. Their remaining capital ships initiated emergency evasive maneuvers, scattering in every direction like insects under a sudden boot. But space is big and mass drivers don't use homing signals. They don't emit targeting pings. The Valen point defense arrays were frantically firing high-energy anti-laser pulses into the empty void, searching for invisible missiles that didn't exist, attempting to jam tracking signals that were never sent. They were fighting ghosts, while cold iron rained down upon them at 45,000 kilometers per second. In the subterranean vaults of Titan, the air was no longer cold. Flash steam roared off the linear acceleration barrels as subterranean cooling jackets failed under the load. Tubes melted, copper coils fused, and safety warnings flashed red across dead monitors. We didn't care. Miller's crew hand-cranked secondary loading mechanisms, jamming tungsten slugs into the glowing, red-hot britches with heavy iron crowbars. We were firing blindly now into their scatter vectors, relying on simple probability and manual elevation adjustments. A heavy Hegemony cruiser tried to shield its smaller escorts, pivoting its massive forward Aegis field directly toward Titan. It raised its defensive barrier to maximum output, dumping thousands of terawatts into a localized energy wall. The tungsten dart didn't care about the energy wall. It hit the cruiser at an angle, penetrating the shield, punching straight through the flight deck, passing through the primary fuel cells, and exiting out the starboard engine block before the shield grid even registered an impact spike. The ship exploded from the inside out, tore apart by its own internal pressure as vacuum reclaimed the hull. 3 centuries of alien tactical supremacy shredded to absolute dust in under 4 minutes. The surviving Hegemony ships, scared, broken, and completely unable to comprehend how a species they deemed primitive was dismantling them without firing a single watt of energy, turned their drive cones toward deep space and engaged warp bursts, fleeing the system in absolute terror. They left behind 12 broken dreadnoughts, 24 shattered escorts, and a floating graveyard of cold metal drifting in the shadows of Saturn's rings. We sat in the steam-filled vault of Titan, listening to the sudden, deafening silence of a quiet solar system. The battle was over. But as our passive arrays scanned the floating wreckage of the Valen lead flagship, our sensors picked up something entirely unexpected coming from inside its shattered command core. The quiet that followed was heavier than the 300 kilometers of ice above our heads. Across the Saturn Gap, 40 alien warships lay ruined, venting frozen fuel, atmosphere, and mangled steel into the rings. The high-tech, invulnerable Valen Hegemony had been broken by the simplest law of the cosmos. They built godlike shields to bend light and harvest thermal fire, but when the universe backed humanity into a corner, we didn't try to outthink their power grids. We just slammed 50 tons of cold, solid metal into their hulls until they stopped breathing. They brought shields to a bullet fight. And they learned, far too late, that human grit doesn't care about alien sophistication. As I stand here in the ruin of Titan's power vault, looking out over the drifting graveyard through our long-range optical arrays, our salvage crews are already burning their engines toward the void. The battle for the Sol system is won, but the war for our ultimate survival is just beginning. From the shattered command core of the Valen flagship, our recovery arrays picked up an encrypted, isolated signal. It wasn't a distress beacon. It was a vault index. Deep inside the twisted wreckage of their lead ship sits a classified, black site archive housing recovered artifacts and forbidden tech, weapons and power sources that even the Hegemony were too terrified to deploy, locked away in the dark. We are pulling that vault out of the wreckage right now. If you are listening to this transmission, if you are standing with humanity on the front lines of this cold universe, make sure you log your clearance right now. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and keep your comms locked to this frequency for the next report. The next chapter of human survival depends on every single one of us holding the line. Because if there is one lesson the galaxy needs to learn about mankind, it is this. You can burn our cities, you can strip away our fire, but as long as we have a rock to throw, we will never, ever surrender.